So the first of the 4 or 5 major Fallout 4 DLCs is almost upon us, and I thought it would be a whole lot of fun to ease ourselves into the impending catastrophe, the new age of DLC, by going over the expansions to the other 2 3D Fallout games. I was originally going to review all of these in a random order, just playing whichever one I felt like, but instead I thought I'd shake up the formula both for my channel and the usual chronological list and review them from best to worst, alternating games. Meaning that this is going to be the first in a series of critiques about Fallout DLC. Additionally, I like to occasionally challenge myself on this channel, and we're building up to a new Bethesda release, so I thought I'd start us all off with Fallout 3. Please keep in mind that this critique of Fallout 3's Point Lookout will be incredibly in-depth, and very likely spoil at least some of Fallout 1, 2, 3, New Vegas, maybe 4, I mean that's kinda sketchy, probably not, and most if not all of the DLC for these games. If you haven't played all of these to story completion and care about spoilers, I recommend you do so before continuing. For the rest of us, however, let's dive, or should I say sail, right into Point Lookout. Point Lookout is Fallout 3's 4th DLC, and is in my opinion vastly superior to all the other expansions for this game. From what I can tell, and of course I haven't asked everyone, but I have looked around a little bit on the Reddit and things like that, maybe about 40% of people who have played Fallout 3 and all the DLCs agree with me. Though I do often see this DLC somewhere towards the middle of the pack on a lot of people's DLC ranking lists. I would tell you exactly why right now, but that would spoil the fun of the video, plus I gotta get my YouTube Red revenue, oh yeah! No, I don't make any money on this. So just like all the other videos on this channel, we'll start from the beginning. Like all the other expansions, and yes, I do consider them expansions for Fallout 3, Point Lookout takes place some distance away from the main game. It takes place at the Fallout equivalent of Point Lookout State Park, a small peninsula in the Chesapeake Bay off the coast of Maryland, meaning that the player either has to arrive either by going around the bay, or by going by boat, and thankfully, Bethesda has chosen the more interesting option. The first thing that happens when the player so much as approaches the boat is an NPC screaming into their ear about what is Bethesda's most overused plot hook, a missing family member. Considering the time of release, this wasn't as much of a bad thing. Bethesda had only made one other Fallout product about a missing member of someone's family, but looking at it now, especially after having watched the new trailer for Point Lookout 2, it's incredibly grating to hear Bethesda's writers mention this kind of stuff. Nowadays, we've had a missing dad, a missing daughter, a missing son, and looking at the trailer for the new game, another missing daughter. However, I think it's fair enough that we let Point Lookout slide with this, because this was 2009 before the latter 2 examples had even existed, and it's a decent enough narrative hook. Like, if for some reason the player had absolutely no reason to go to Point Lookout right before they approach the boat, they at least have some reason to go there now. And if you don't care about it, it's not like the game is going to shove it in your face anytime soon, so that's nice. After we get verbally assaulted by Catherine, we go speak to Tobar, the owner of the boat, or more so, we get spoken to by Tobar, because apparently I can't just talk to him myself. Fuck you, Tobar. Tobar is the owner of the Duchess Gambit, a boat that we're going to take to Point Lookout, and is currently our only way of getting there unless we want to actually walk around the entire Chesapeake Bay, which is just silly. It's from him that we can purchase a ticket into Point Lookout, and I really like the way that Fallout 3 does this. Most games would probably have getting a ticket just be a special dialogue option, but Fallout 3 keeps itself within its game mechanics and actually just opens up the barter menu for you. It's incredibly simple, and maybe a little bit stupid of a solution, but it works so well. You actually have to buy the ticket from Tobar like you do with any other item in the game, and they're not going to knock down the price for you either. It actually has a pretty reasonable price for what a ticket might cost in Fallout, meaning that Point Lookout is willing at the very beginning of the DLC to tell the player, if you can't afford it, go get some money and come back when you can. When most games would be eager to get the player into the new content as fast as possible to avoid the player getting frustrated that they can't access the content they just bought. It's a little bit of a risk that Bethesda took here, and I'm actually kind of glad they did it, because it creates a really fun little moment, especially if you actually don't have the money to go. It doesn't accommodate the player's wallet at all. It takes it completely out of the equation and tells the player that if you want to go into this DLC, you better fork over the cash. If you don't have the cash, good, get out. And the fact that it does this without any kind of special sequences or dialogue options, it just opens up a menu players are very familiar with and associate with buying things, is really, really clever. Though I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me, because I guess it's just not convenient to expect that the player knows that you have to buy something with money. After we purchase our ticket, Tobar asks us to go take a nap in his cot, and we're on our way to Point Lookout. We wake up sometime later and are treated to a pretty neat introductory cutscene that shows off some of the landscape. Personally, I would have honestly preferred they allowed the player just a little bit of freedom and let us explore the boat a bit, even if they have to restrict your weapons to prevent you from being able to shoot the swamp pick, though I think it would be a little bit hilarious to let people snipe it and ruin the atmosphere for themselves. However, I don't really see this as a restriction of player freedom, because there isn't much to do on the boat anyway, even if it is coming in and you're allowed to walk around with guns. I see it as just a neat little way to introduce the player to this map's atmosphere, which transitions almost perfectly into the first thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to Point Lookout. The atmosphere. Personally, I think Point Lookout has some of the best atmosphere the 3D Fallout games have produced. It's very clearly going for some kind of pseudo-horror vibe. The map is covered with a lot of fog, which, much like darkness, obfuscates a player's vision. Because, you can't see past fog, right? And because you can't see past fog, it can also make some people feel a little bit claustrophobic, because you can technically see the fog, just not past the fog. Claustrophobia and the unknown, especially in your immediate vicinity, can be pretty spooky things. But that's not all. The first thing that players see in Far Harbor is the silhouette of a swamp hick, which are kind of creepy in their first instance because you can't really see what's wrong with them, but you know that something is wrong with them because they look mostly human, but have some weird physiology and mutations to them, and they move in a very uncanny way. They're walking but sort of struggling to do so, which can be a little creepy because of the way they shamble and limp around. And to top it all off, if you ask Tobar about any safe locations in Far Harbor, you only get a few locations as an answer, a hunting shack and the town that you're in. The Pier Town is an old rundown circus, which is a pretty easy thing to make creepy since circuses for a lot of people are often in kind of the uncanny valley of what is truly whimsical and what is truly creepy. And to top it off, this one's all broken down and it's all, battered and busted up. And there's only one person in it. Additionally, if you ask him about Calvert Mansion, Tobar gives a weird answer where he almost suggests that the player should go to Calvert Mansion and is advertising all the loot that we could get. And he seems to be hiding something, completely dodging the question about the smoke. I actually have two very small gripes to make about the very opening of this, however. I don't think that Tobar's dialogue feels very real, I suppose. It might just be me knowing that I'm playing Fallout 3, but the way Tobar advertises Calvert Mansion feels a little artificial. The way he constantly advertises loot and monsters, and if I guess you boil Fallout down to its very most basic elements, that's what all players are looking for. But personally, I would have wished if Tobar actually advised we didn't go there. I actually kind of wish that they didn't make it so obvious that Calvert Mansion was a thing. They not only give it a few seconds of time in the intro cinematic, but also has a giant fucking smokestack coming out of it. Mix that in with Tobar suggesting that we go there so heavily, and it kind of feels like you're nudged towards it instead of finding it out yourself. I think personally it would have been best just to have Tobar advise not to go there and just have the smokestack. Because if you do stuff like that, some players might not even go to it, they'll probably think it's just some kind of side content. On the other hand, other players might think of it as a challenge and go towards it, meaning that the people who want to go out and explore that are doing so of their own accord instead of just because Tobar is telling us to. And this is a series about exploration, so when you actually get to explore stuff, it feels really rewarding. While I'm in griping territory and still in the early bits of the DLC, I want to talk about the pier. The pier, to me at least, seems like an attempt at emulating the construction of old-school point-and-click horror games. In those games like Darkseed and Harvester, the player is usually placed in some kind of creepy, unsettling location that is masqueraded by a very thin layer of innocence, usually in some kind of a town setting. The more the player delves into the secret of the place or town they're in, the more obviously wrong everything will appear to be, but the player always has a safe haven or NPC that they can find solitude in no matter how creepy things get. I would say that the pier is trying to build itself up like this because it's a very similar situation, even if it isn't entirely intentional. At the current moment of the game, you're in a location that's quite creepy and unnerving, though you're not totally sure why yet, and so far the only safe location you know about that doesn't require you to go adventuring into the creep is the pier. The pier itself is a safe area with no enemies, a single human NPC if you don't count Tobar, an inn, and a little bit of robot security to make the place look like it's somewhere where people want to live, like they're defending it. Our one human NPC also just happens to be a vendor, meaning that the player can pretty much take care of everything they need to right here from the pier. It's like a little hub. However, assuming this was the intention, I don't think it works. Mainly because the place is just so empty, and it's kind of weird for this place to be barren. It's apparently one of the few safe locations in an otherwise very hostile environment. And apparently it's also a place where Tobar and maybe other boating services are apparently dropping off travelers and tourists. And I find it a bit suspicious that not a single other person has bothered to stay here, or at least is currently sticking around for a bit. Especially considering how easy it would be to defend, but with it being backed up against the water. Additionally strange, because this is probably one of the only places on the island that is receiving trade or transportation. You'd have thought this might have turned into a little town. I really like the idea of having a little haven like this, so personally what I would have done is maybe barricaded the little shopping area, placed a couple of guards, or maybe just one guard character, moved Harley out from his hardware store into the town, into the little bazaar type thing, and maybe had it so that there's a very small chance that when the player loads this cell or walks into a trigger or whatever, yeah, I know how this game works, Bethesda, you can't trick me, it has a chance to spawn an NPC like just a generic Wastelander or something like that, just to make the place feel a little bit more populated. Now, Point Lookout is one of the least linear Fallout DLCs out there, right up there with Old World Blues and to a slightly lesser extent Honest Hearts. In my original playthrough here, I explored around a bit, however, I thought it might be a better idea to go out and check out this Calvert nonsense. I mean, I have all day to meander around the island, and this Calvert guy might need my help now. Another small thing I want to talk about here is the walk over to Calvert's estate. The lack of enemies here, especially the lack of any swamp honkies, is great. It helps reinforce the unknown of the atmosphere, because you can tell something is really wrong with Calvert's estate, but you can't tell what it is. Unfortunately, this is ruined the moment the player walks up to the door, and the quest marker spoils that not only is the owner of the mansion alive, but that they're under siege. It probably would have been better to just let the player figure this out by, walking into the mansion. It's not like we're going anywhere, we're already at the door. Once we walk into Calvert's place, we're thrown into the aforementioned siege. There's a minor thing I like about this, but I'll get into that later. The player helps Desmond defend his mansion from the incoming tribals. The way this is handled is pretty interesting because it employs a lot more cinematic moments than most other things in the entirety of Fallout 3 or New Vegas. The tribals can come in by chopping up the house in various places, breaking in new entrances for themselves in the ceilings, from the doors, actually having, wood panels flying all over the place. The way they do this is pretty simple, actually. They just spawn a couple of wooden pieces and have them fly out, mixed with, some dust, just in case they need to hide the fact that part of the floorboard's model is changing. But it is a pretty decent effect for 2009 and, the Game Brio engine. It's a neat little engagement, and luckily, it doesn't overstay its welcome, because it is quite linear. You're literally fighting through hallways. And, feeling trapped in Fallout, usually not the best idea. You want player freedom, yada yada yada. After the player takes out the tribals, they return to Desmond and prepare for a, and I quote, dramatic last stand. At this moment, the player must act with haste, laying down their defenses as the incoming horde is nearly upon them. And once the tribals are in, the player has to coordinate with Desmond, using the mansion's layout and armaments to intelligently dispose of the opposition, and during the final wave of invasion, have their wits and their skills tested as the room teems with tribals, forcing the player to use every tactic they've learned throughout their entire adventure in the wasteland, in what might be the most difficult combat section in Fallout 3. And after that, we talk to Desmond. Turns out he doesn't really know why the tribals keep attacking them. He has a couple of ballpark guesses, but he has no real theories. He enlists the player to go and figure out what's going on, with the promises of riches, which, that's pretty easy Fallout player bait. Pretty much easy bait for anybody, really. He tells us to go to their cathedral, and to get some information out of the tribe's leader, which is going to force us into some of that exploration we didn't do earlier. I mean, technically our character doesn't exactly know where the cathedral is, so I guess we're going to have to, look around a little bit and actually do some real exploring. Okay, time to address the elephant in the room with Far Harbor here. The exploration. It's, how do I put this? It's really good. Didn't see that one coming, did you, motherfucker? I would liken the exploration in Point Lookout to be kind of like the exploration in Fallout 3. It's a lot of dungeons and a lot of side quests, but for the most part, you're basically going to different chunks of the map that all have their own little story or problem that you have to resolve that don't really interconnect with other parts of the map. It's kind of like bingo, you got a bunch of squares that represent parts of the map and you check them all off as you come across them and deal with their various problems, whether it's killing the few enemies that are in this house, or doing the quest that's here, or talking to these NPCs, or whatever. And I'd like to compare it to Old World Blues. Old World Blues does have an open world, yeah, but most of the content is hidden away pretty much all in dungeons. There's no interconnecting factions that don't already have some kind of role in the main story, and most of the quests and stories are isolated, although they are pretty good. I'm not a big fan of the amount of Chinese communist stuff that was in Fallout 3, but I have to say the Velvet Curtain is actually a pretty great quest. Not necessarily because of what you do, because what you do isn't really fun or unique in any way. You're mostly just going around and finding things and listening to notes, but it's the story that it tells that is a lot of fun, and that's what Fallout's based on, right? It's stories. It's one of the few Chinese communist things in Fallout 3 that I think works with the pre-existing lore of the Chinese in America. They had infiltrated a lot of the American government, and probably a lot of the American society. Or I guess populace might be a better word for that one. Either way, the Chinese have pretty much dug their claws into America, and this quest is all about a Chinese spy, which already, that's espionage, that has to do with infiltration, destroying some evidence of her existence by blowing up a submarine. And I wouldn't really cite this as an example of Bethesda making something just for the cool factor, because, I mean, blowing up a submarine is fucking cool, first off. And it could have been very easy just to make this quest really cool, because, I mean, holy crap, we get to blow up a submarine. But if you just sit back for a second, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, a spy who is in an infiltration mission is going to want to destroy any evidence of their location, or their identity, or their existence. Though I have to say, I think the actual blowing up of the submarine part does maybe kind of trip into the rule of cool area, because think about this in the pre-war setting. A giant explosion going off in the middle of the night is probably going to scare some people and start setting off alarm bells. And since Point Lookout has a Navy presence, they're probably going to investigate what's going on, meaning that unless all of the evidence was destroyed, and I mean all of it, they're probably going to find something out about the spy. I think maybe it would have been better just to have the quest be a little bit more modest, like, oh, burn all the documents or something like that. Or, you know, set the submarine onto autopilot and have it go back to China or something like that. Either way, it's still my favorite, and I think a lot of other people's favorite quest in Point Lookout, because it finally tells a Chinese communist story that fits within the Fallout lore and isn't complete trash, mostly because it's actually believable. Unlike a certain other couple of examples of Chinese things in Fallout 3, like the People's Republic of America. Chinese ghouls! The world, or I guess island of Point Lookout is also just a lot of fun to explore because, in my opinion at least, it looks quite interesting. Before Fallout 4, obviously, Point Lookout was one of the only things in Fallout that really delved into swamp territory. There were some very, very small swampish locations towards the north of the Capital Wasteland, but Point Lookout basically has the majority stake in all of the swamps in Fallout. So that already makes the natural landscape a pretty unique place to piddle around in. Combine that with the coastal culture of the old world inhabitants with things like piers and lighthouses and a lot of boat wrecks, plus the really creepy post-war tribal effigies and, you know, totems and things that are scattered around the place, and you have a pretty interesting location. Especially so since this isn't some smaller chunk of a larger world like 3 and New Vegas' locations are. Point Lookout maintains these details throughout the entire island. The Fallout DLCs usually have a more consistent landscape and art style than the main games do because they're a lot smaller and more focused on a smaller part of the world. And I think that all of the DLCs, despite one, do this pretty well. They don't really seem to get stale in my opinion because they all have, you know, usually interesting aesthetics or art styles or landscapes or whatever that you don't get bored of seeing even though you might spend 10 hours in this location. I mean, obviously if you sit in Point Lookout for 30 hours or something, you're going to get tired of looking at it, because as far as the visuals go at least, there isn't as much variation as the main games. But if you play for the intended playtime of, like I said, around 10 hours in Point Lookout's case, you're probably going to have a fun time staring at everything. And this was probably especially refreshing back in 2009 because players hadn't gotten a new DLC to explore in months. However, I suppose this doesn't really matter because art is purely subjective. What I like may be something someone else doesn't like. However, this horror-type swampland wasn't done in Fallout before, so we can at least agree that it's unique. And that's my point, is that it's unique, and it took me, 20 minutes to get that across. But yeah, the exploration is pretty good for an expansion. It suits the series well considering how much of it there is, and this is, a series based on freedom and exploration. And it's actually kind of important for a couple of reasons, not only because there's a lot of content, but it's also pretty good content, meaning that Point Lookout is, or at least was, worth buying back in the day. For just $15, you probably got about what I would imagine is 1/10 of the average playtime of Fallout 3, if you count, the whales who play the game a whole bunch, and then the people who don't play it very much at all. And this is important because the value proposition of Fallout DLC has been a little controversial very recently, especially considering the expansion-style content is now being charged for $25 instead of $15. So, just saying, if Far Harbor is even as good as Point Lookout, or any of the other Fallout 3 New Vegas expansions, there's probably going to be some unhappy customers wondering why it costs a little more. Just something to keep in mind for the incoming future. Back on the main plot, we arrive at the cathedral, and are told by somebody inside to go and get some seeds from the Great Punga plant. This mission is likely to be one of the first, or the first, encounters the players have with swamp folk, because the quest marker directs them straight through a big pack of them around a house. It's avoidable, sure, but I'd bet a majority of players on their first run through this DLC got into a tussle with them. I think that swamp folk are a bit of a missed opportunity. The first one we ever see is a really good mood setter because of how strangely it moves around and clutches whatever weapon it has. The swamp folk the player actually encounter aren't nearly as creepy, and the idea that they're going to be some kind of horrible, threatening monster is kind of destroyed when you see them holding guns and moving around like normal human beings. It's the guns that bother me the most, however, not only because guns are probably the least scary way for a swamp folk or any enemy in this entire franchise to be scary, because Fallout is a series that is absolutely drenched in firearms, but because their wielding of guns actually makes them a little bit overpowered. If I had been in charge of the implementation of the swamp folk, I wouldn't have ever had thought of giving them guns. I think it would be a lot more threatening and memorable to give them a less human set of animations, maybe something a little bit more like a zombie, and having them wield some kind of creepy horror movie melee weapon, like how the bruisers wield axes. Partially because I find that that's a lot scarier than just a dude with a gun, but also because it might help balance them out a bit. I would argue that the swamp folk, especially the bruisers, are the strongest enemies in Point Lookout, even more so than the reavers. Firstly, the swamp folk have incredibly high stats. Even the small ones are far stronger and tougher than normal human beings and ghouls, and they're more powerful than mirelurks. I checked around the files and found that even the weakest swamp folk are more powerful than swamp lurks, and that the strongest swamp folk is more powerful than a swamp lurk queen, even though they're the same level. Not only that, but swamp folk can employ double-barrel shotguns. The only ranged weapon of any kind that the Lurk family has is the goo spit attack, which has an obvious lead-in that the player can use to prepare for the incoming blob of goo. The shotgun has no telegraphing and can't be dodged. Not only that, but the double barrel is already a very strong weapon. It has as many projectiles as the other shotguns, less spread than the sawn-off, and more damage than the combat shotgun. The way Fallout handles pellet damage is to divide the total damage of the weapon by the number of pellets that it's firing, so 85 divided by 9. So for the double barrel, it's 9.4 damage per pellet. You might be thinking that the way to deal with the swamp folk then is to stay far away with a long-range weapon because their spread means you only get hit for like 27 damage at max. And while that is still a viable strategy for the shotgun wielders, there's still a problem with it. The problem is that in the hands of enemies, the double-barrel shotgun gets a boost to its damage. A couple of guns do this, like the tri-beam laser rifle, boosting the damage of a weapon in the hands of an enemy to compensate for their lack of real weapons skills. Because a lot of enemies in Fallout, even the ones that can wield guns, don't have the same stats that human characters do. They don't have a big guns or a small gun skill or endurance or anything like that. Usually, the game will add an additional 35 damage to a weapon. That's not too high, especially at later stages in the game's lifespan where the player has better armor and more health. But the problem is, the double barrel doesn't apply 35 damage per gun. It applies 35 damage per pellet. Meaning that a meat shot against the player by one of the swamp folk is going to deal an additional 315 damage on top of the 85 damage it's already dealing. A grand total of 405 damage. And to provide perspective as to how much that really is, that's enough to one-shot a super mutant master and have 45 damage to spare, which is enough to one-shot a mole rat, and leaves an additional 5 damage still to spare. And this is compounded by the fact that a lot of swamp folk spawn in some form of pack. At best, the player is going to have to be dealing with one ranged guy with a shotgun and one other axe guy, assuming there is a shotgun in the pack at all. Some packs, however, have multiple shotgun guys, which is an insane amount of damage being thrown at the player. Oh, and just in case you aren't still convinced that this might be a little bit too many numbers floating around, the strongest bruiser swamp folk has more unarmed damage than a death claw. However you do or don't deal with swamp folk, the player makes their way to the Great Punga Cave. The cave is another example of strange linearity and cinematics for a Fallout game, and I'm not sure it all works. This moment in the cave tries far too hard to be creepy, so much so that it becomes really silly. It starts off by trying to scare the player with bobbleheads that have an ominous pop-ups text. Then the player walks around some trees that drop Nuka-Colas that explode with the baby sound effect from Fallout 3's opening. Then the player gets attacked by ghouls that aren't really ghouls, and pretty much proves that this segment isn't going to hurt the player in any way because they disappear upon getting near you. Which makes the entire sequence pretty bland, because you're not in any danger, and now you know it. It doesn't end particularly strong either. The Megaton bomb explodes, and the player is shoved into a loading screen, and then back into normal gameplay with no filter in between. It's not all bad. I personally like the entrance to the cave a whole lot, and the part where they flip it upside down is cool, but beyond that, I can't imagine anyone is actually getting creeped out by this. It just tries so hard to be unsettling. So much so that it betrays the fact that it's trying this hard to be unsettling. Instead of just having a skeleton, they have a skeleton named Mom. Instead of having normal bodies float in the river, they have corpses of popular Fallout 3 characters like Moira Brown. Comes off as incredibly forced, mostly because it's forcing the idea that this is scary down your throat. If they had been willing to actually put the player in some amount of danger, or to just have generic skeletons and corpses floating up from the river, this might have been a little bit more creepy. As it stands now, it's just way too obvious that this is supposed to be scary, and because of that, it isn't. After we wake up from the cave cinematic, we return to the tribe and gain access to the cathedral, where we finally meet Nadine. She explains to us that the tribals are performing hackneyed lobotomies to the people who join the tribe, and that includes us and her. Despite knowing this, she seems perfectly content with living among them. I guess losing a vital part of her body just doesn't bother her as much as not going back home with some money. In the cathedral, we get the location of Jackson, the tribal leader, who's off meditating. We hightail it back over to Desmond to give him the news. I actually want to take a moment to talk about Desmond, because he's my favorite character in the entire DLC. His dialogue is hilariously sarcastic, and if this video didn't really tip you off, I'm pretty into sarcasm. He's vulgar, he's rude, he's as cool as anyone on Point Lookout could hope to be. The only minor thing I dislike about Desmond is his voice acting. It gets a little weird sometimes.
The answer is training, you ignorant fuck! I've got 100 years of experience on you, and don't you forget it. Stick by me and you'll get a master's class in doing what has to be done. What has to be done, what has to be done.
Yeah, a little weird even for a ghoul. And additionally, it's not really a good interpretation of an English accent. I don't actually know if the voice actor is English. I looked him up and his IMDb page is pretty much barren, and it seems he's only known for his Bethesda stuff. The other characters he's sort of pretty much all American, like Stockholm and Sergeant IR3. Desmond is the only character I can find that's supposed to be English, and it isn't done very well. I suppose you could say his accent is supposed to be suppressed, because he hasn't been in England for 200 years, so it becomes a transatlantic accent, but after 200 years, I doubt he would even have an accent. In any case, I still really like Desmond more than any other character in Point Lookout by far. As per Desmond's instructions, we go out to the thinking cave and find Jackson, talking to a hologram of a brain. A sentient brain with no body, or any other functioning major organs. Yeah. This is where the player is introduced to Calvert, who feels pretty rule of cool. It's not the worst thing Bethesda's ever done, and I like how they handle it by not handling it. Calvert's lack of body is explained with quite literally the term science, said as enthusiastically as they could master. Bethesda isn't attempting to say that this insanely silly character and situation are in any way a major or serious part of the lore, and it works because they just embrace the stupidity of it. We talk to Calvert for a bit, and he tells us a plan of his to increase the range of his holograms. After that, we return to Desmond, and he tells us to place a doohickey on the Ferris wheel to find Calvert's location. Once we arrive there, Calvert tells us not to place the doohickey and instead work for him. This choice, as you learn later, isn't as fleshed out as it could have been. No matter what, you still have to storm Calvert's place, and you have to choose who to kill at the very last moment. We're just gonna go with Desmond for now, because he hasn't tried to kill us by proxy anytime recently. We return to Desmond to watch his dogs explode and find him in the safe room. Here we plan out our last attack on Calvert, who's living just a bit from Desmond, who somehow never figured that out. That's kinda stupid, but okay. We stock up in the safe room and storm Calvert's fortress. We do so, choose who we're gonna kill, and that's kind of it. It's not the greatest ending, it might have been a little disappointing, but I like it. The player was never super involved in this little war between Calvert and Desmond, and only show up at the very end of it, like the very, very end of it, where the reason it ends. And we have a pretty uninvolved ending to go with it, which I think works with the whole idea of the story. And I also like how the player is rewarded here at the very end. Instead of giving us some quest rewards by Desmond, like, 90% of the rest of Fallout, Desmond just tells us to take some shit and fuck off. And that's exactly what we do, once again keeping the story within the normal gameplay, just like buying the ticket. And that's Point Lookout. I griped a lot in this video, I do that in all of my videos, but I still think Point Lookout is the best DLC for Fallout 3. It's open, it begs the player to explore it, it has a tar-thick atmosphere, likable characters, and a fun story with a lot of interesting sequences that never really take itself serious enough to be considered poorly made, unlike other pieces of DLC for Fallout 3 that we'll get into later. All in all, I think Point Lookout is just a fun extension on Fallout 3, without any pretentious plot decisions to act as if the story is more important than it really is. It's just a lot of fun. Creepy, unsettling, completely ridiculous fun. Join me next time in the Mojave Wasteland as we look at my favorite Fallout New Vegas DLC. If you liked this video, please consider looking at some of my other videos in case you're interested in subscribing. They're not as good as this one is going to be, but you should get a general idea of what I have going on here before making that decision. That's all for now. Hopefully you had a lot of fun with this video, and I'll see you again. Oh, and by the way, I didn't forget about my nitpicking explanation. We'll get into that next time, I promise.